Hi. This week, I want to do something a little bit different, and instead of just sharing my own thoughts about biblical and theological topics, I want to share what I hope will be the first on a series of book and author recommendations. Now, I want to say that even though I am an academic and I have academic training, the purposes of these kind of reviews and these kind of recommendations are not about trying to be academically as perfectly accurate as possible. I'm sure that if they were an expert in these particular authors or on these particular works, they would come along and say something much more complete and much more truly accurate. My point is to mainly share these things that have had a significant impact on me personally and how they've shaped me and how they might be interesting to you as well. Although, of course, I'm going to do my best to be as accurate as I can. A lot of the people who have been around me over the last few years have almost certainly heard me talk about Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard as I've heard it's more accurately pronounced. Well, anyway, I was thinking about doing a general recommendation about the Kierkegaard as an author, and then I started to realize I've really actually only read a handful of his books, but they've been significant enough for me that I wanted to share at least one of them with you. The thing is, to say I've only read a handful of the books of an author is not usually for most people a problem, because there's a lot of people who simply write the same basic kinds of things over and over again, or they're taking their old insights and applying them in new ways. And so if you've read a few of them, you know enough to be getting on with. You know enough to know where they come from, whether you like them or not. But Kierkegaard's different, because he had a writing career of only about 10 years, and in that 10 years he had an immense literary output. And what makes it complicated is not just the length and breadth of it, but also because he did this thing that I've never heard of anybody else doing. Kierkegaard wrote many things in his own name. And when he wrote those, they were usually pretty straightforward, encouraging, upbuilding discourses in one way or another. But he also wrote an entirely different stream where he wrote under a series of pseudonyms. And sometimes these pseudonyms would even argue with one another. And so what's important about that is that when we read one of Kierkegaard's works that's being written from the point of view of a pseudonym, we can't necessarily just jump to the idea that Kierkegaard affirms everything that the pseudonym affirms. It's possible that the pseudonym is articulating a viewpoint with which Kierkegaard disagrees. It might be that they're overstating it. It may be that he's exploring some kind of viewpoint. If you've been watching these videos for some time now, you'll know that I referred to Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling, which was written under the pseudonym of Johannes de Silencio, or John of the Silence. When I was talking about Genesis 22, which is the time when Abraham nearly sacrifices Isaac. Now, I can't say that the entire book was full of things that impacted me in a deep way, but there were certain moments in there that single-handedly reshifted the way that I think about a very difficult passage, and has taught me a whole new way of seeing things. What I want to lift up for today is a collection of writings that have been gathered together, and they were written under Kierkegaard's own name, that have come down to us published as a collection called his Attack on Christendom. Now, just at the very beginning, I want to make sure I'm clear that it's the attack on Christendom and not an attack on Christianity, and certainly not an attack on the gospel. The whole point of this collection of writings comes because a bishop whom Kierkegaard knew personally died, and a professor did a eulogy that was very glowing, and they were talking about how this particular bishop was one of the great witnesses to the truth. It was part of this great chain of witnesses that extends from the apostles down to our own day. Well, Kierkegaard said he couldn't simply sit by quietly while this nonsense was being proclaimed. Now, he said it is true that the bishop is truly the exemplification of all the things that the Danish clergy hold most dear, but he was saying that because he is, first and foremost, a civil servant and someone who is more concerned about their comfort than indeed anything else. Certainly one thing was the case, according to Kierkegaard. Whatever this bishop preached on Sunday morning was not going to be taken as a challenge on how he should live on Monday. So the first half of this book are all articles that Kierkegaard published in a newspaper that are dealing with what he considered to be the problem. And the topics range from things like the Danish clergy in particular, the problems of the Danish church in general, the way that we sometimes quietly substitute things in the place of the gospel, and about how sometimes we take things and in order to try to make them easier or better, we can sometimes undermine the very core of the gospel itself. The second half of the book is also very interesting. It's less focused on a particular topic and a little more freely chosen range of topics, but they're in the same kind of spirit. Well, I have been rereading this book every year in the springtime, and I've said that it helps to keep me honest. It helps me to keep my feet on the ground, because it reminds me of what really is important, and it reminds me to pay attention to the things that go on in my life and in the church that I'm a part of that might be distracting me from it. While it's true that some of Kierkegaard's criticisms don't land quite as fully here in America, where we don't have churches that are funded primarily by public taxes, it still lands close enough to home to challenge me every time that I read it. Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom is a reminder for me of why I appreciate the fact that there are people out there who are willing to put forward potentially even extreme positions. So the idea is, I don't know if I 100% agree with all the things that Kierkegaard says. I'm not 100% sure that I'm on his side on everything, but one thing that I always look forward to when I read it is I know he is going to stake out a position that is more radical than I tend to hold. And I need to be reminded that someone can read the Gospels and come to the conclusions that he comes to, because it reminds me that my goal is not to be in the middle. My goal is not to be somewhere relative to my peers. My goal is to be where I should be based on what the Gospel is. And Kierkegaard's writing, especially in this book, reminds me more clearly than perhaps any other time or any other book that I read that is something that can be very sneaky. We can get distracted without noticing it, and we may find down the road, if we're not being careful, to see in what ways, in the name of the church and in the name of the gospel, we have in fact worked against the gospel. I said I reread this every year. I find that by the end of the year after I've read it, the grip it has on me has somewhat waned over the time, like it does with any kind of powerful experience. I have found this year, though, that it has held me much more tightly than it has in the past, that I find myself saying the kinds of feisty things that I might not have been saying if I hadn't been continually being shaped by Kierkegaard's vision of the gospel. I am looking forward to reading it again. In just a few months, I'll be reading it again, and I am excited because it reminds me that the gospel can never be domesticated for the sake of popularity. That if indeed we have substituted popularity for the truth of the gospel, we have far departed from the New Testament, and we must repent and we must return to what God has called us to be. So I don't know if you've ever had the sense at any point in your life where you felt that you've gotten complacent, that you have somehow kind of gotten lazy in your faith. And if that's the case, and I know that I have had moments like that in my life, then I totally recommend Kierkegaard's Attack on Christendom. And if nothing else, even if you don't agree with him, even if you dislike what he has to say, I guarantee you he will come at you in a way that is forceful, that is challenging, and will make you think, even if at the end of the day you disagree with him. So, that's all I have for this week. If you have any questions or have any topics you'd like me to take up, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. If you can also subscribe and like these things on Facebook, or you can also go to the YouTube channel where my channel is tstevik1, and you can watch things there as well. If you like these videos, if you find them interesting, if you find them stimulating, even if you don't always agree with what I have to say, consider liking them or sharing them on Facebook. It does make it easier for other people to see them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.